Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to solve mathematical problems by using the properties of real numbers. And in the do now, we're going to get right to it. It says tell whether each pair of expressions is equal by completing each statement, equal or not equal. So we are going to go 34 plus 12. If you don't know, if it's equal to 12 plus 34, you could put it in the calculator, or you could just add them together or know the properties. So this is 46, and this one would be 46 as well. So of course they are equal. That is commutative property of addition. 100 minus 1 is 99. 1 minus 100 is negative 99. These do not equal each other. Commutative property does not work for subtraction. 0 plus 180 is 180, and 180 plus 0 is the same thing. That is commutative property of addition. Remember when your teacher would taught you first that you're multiplying or you're dividing fractions. And when you divide fractions, you do keep, change, flip. So it's 18 times 18. All right. And 18 times 18, that's not 18. So this is not equal to. 45 minus 1, which is 44, does not equal 45. And then 6 times 1/6 actually does equal 1. All right? Because when you multiply fractions like this, 6 times 1, numerator times numerator, and then denominator times denominator. So for the Regents prep, the product of 5 and a number is 80. Which of the following could be that number? So I'm just going to go and highlight product 5 and a number, and then this is, and we're going to say 80 right here. We're going to just annotate on top like we did in that first lesson. Product is multiplication. 5 and a number is 5n. Or 5x is an equal sign in 80. So pretty much it is just 5x equals 80. And when you divide by 5 using inverse operations, we're going to divide by 5 on both sides, and we're going to have x equals, and how many times does 5 go into 80? And you're just looking at your calculator just to make sure. 80 divided by 5, that is 16. So we're going to talk about that and encircle it. All right, remember, all the time you use inverse operations of what you see. If you see multiplication, that's why we're dividing to get that x alone. All right. So here are the properties of real numbers. The commutative property of addition and multiplication just says that you can change the order that you're adding or multiplying. It would equal the same thing. So you can change the order. The addends will not change in the sum. And you can multiply the different orders and it will not change the product. It's important to remember that the commutative property does not work with addition, with subtraction, or division. All right, just like that do now, it does not work. Here's the associative property of addition and multiplication. Just remember that associative property states that you can multiply or add regardless of how the numbers are grouped. It does not matter where you put the parentheses, only for addition and multiplication. So here we talk about 3 plus 4 plus 5 is equal to 3 plus 4 plus 5. The only thing that changed in that left-hand side is the grouping. The grouping changed, but it's still equal to 12. Also here, the multiplication, 2 times 3 with the parentheses around it times 5, and then 2 times 3 times 5 with the parentheses now in a different grouping. That is equal to 30. So you could switch that around. That's the associative property. So the associative property states you can add or multiply regardless of how those numbers are grouped. So this is an example. Put the parentheses around another grouping of numbers using the associative property. So you could see the parentheses around the x plus 7, and then it's plus 9. So you're just going to switch it to 7 plus 9. And that's it. So this would be the same, equal the same thing, according to associative property. The distributive property of multiplication over addition is very important. They do mention it a lot. It's basically when you're distributing, you're talking about multiplying the number on the outside of the parentheses by the numbers, the terms inside the parentheses. 3 times 10 and 3 times x. So this right here is addition, and that's why it's called multiplication over addition. This one right here, again, we're going to talk about 5 times x. This is distributive property, and 5 times negative 4. Since this is happening over subtraction, they call it multiplication, distributive property of multiplication over subtraction. All right, and that is it for that. So identity property, when you're talking about addition and multiplication only, we're talking about a number, in order to be the same, keeps its identity. You start with a number, you end with that same number, right? So if it's a plus 0, it equals a. That's identity property of addition. 0 plus a could be turned around because that's commutative property. 0 plus a equals a. Identity property, you're starting with one number. That's not really great. You're starting with this one number. That's not great either. And you're ending with that same number. All right. So this one right here, you're going to talk about multiplication. Multiplication is a times 1 equals a, and 1 times a equals a. You start with a, you end with a. It's identity property. We're identifying what that number is. All right. So starting with 15, ending with 15. Identity property. Zero property is when you're multiplying for multiplication and it equals 0. So pretty easy when we're talking about equals to 0. When you talk about multiplication, making something equal to 0 is just when you multiply by 0. So 5 times 0 is 0, and a times 0, anything times 0, is 0. This one is a little bit more difficult, and a lot of people do forget it. The inverse property of addition, the opposite, and multiplication is the reciprocal. So it's a little bit confusing. So for the addition part, we're adding opposites and it equals to 0. It's not the zero property. Zero property is only for multiplication. So this is called the inverse property because you're adding the opposite to whatever is existing first. So a plus negative a is the opposite of a, and that equals 0. This is called the inverse property. Adding opposites, we're starting with 12. And we are adding negative 12, the opposite to it, so it's equal to 0. There is no zero property for addition. All right, this is zero property of multiplication, like on the top right here, what we just did, but there's no zero property of addition. We're adding the opposites. Now, for multiplication, it's a little bit different. The opposite now, what we're talking about, we're multiplying the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of a number is just the flip of that fraction, that numerator and denominator. So if we start with A, the reciprocal of A is 1 over A. The reciprocal, you're switching the numerator and the denominator, and that's it. Because this right here, when we're starting, is A over 1. If you flip it, that's the reciprocal, and you multiply them, it'll always equal 1. And the same thing here with 26. 26 is really 26 over 1. We just don't write it that way. The reciprocal of 26 over 1 is 1 over 26. When we multiply those, then we have something equal to 1. So I'll just give you another example. An example of this would be, let me just start with 3. 3 times 1 over 3 would be 3 over 3. Because you multiply numerator times numerator and denominator times denominator, this is 3 times 1 is 3, and 1 times 3 is 3. So that does equal 1. So whenever you multiply that reciprocal, it's called the inverse property of multiplication. Whenever you add the opposite, it equals 0, that's the inverse property of addition. A little bit tricky, but we'll kind of go over it. So we went over distributive property just a little bit before, but we're going to talk about it again. This is multiplication property over addition. All right, these are all distributive properties. And the multiplication property over addition means that it happens when you're multiplying, you're doing that over addition. And when you're doing that over addition, you're distributing over addition. It's called distributive property over addition. When you're distributing over subtraction, it's called distributive property over subtraction. And it's right here. You can see it. It's right there. So distributive property of multiplication over addition and distributive property of multiplication over subtraction. All right, so it says on your own, name the property that each statement illustrates. So we're going to do that. This right here, just remember, we're talking about grouping. Grouping changes. If the grouping changes, that is called commutative property. And I'm sorry, it's not commutative property. It is associative property. When the grouping changes, that's associative property. So we're going to say associative property of addition. And on to number 2, 45 plus 0 equals 45. So remember, we're starting with a number and we're ending with that same number. So we got 45 here, start, and ending with the same number. So this is called identity property. Of addition. So for number 3, we're going to talk about 0 times 12. And it equals 0. All right? Equals 0. So this is the 0 property. Of multiplication. And matter of fact, if you look back, you could see zero property is only for multiplication. So they probably won't ever say zero property of multiplication. It is just like I'm just putting it. All right. So it's just there. But it's just going to be zero property. 9 plus 3 equals 3 plus 9. Remember, we're switching the order. We're switching the order. So that is commutative property of addition, switching that order. And now number 5, 76 plus a negative 76. Just remember, just take a look. It equals 0, but it's not zero property. It is inverse property of addition. It is the inverse, adding the opposite. So we're just going to put, that's what I'm going to put up top, adding the opposite. And that is inverse property of addition. That's the one that a lot of people do get confused about. Just remember, zero property is only for multiplication. Inverse property is like actually adding the opposite when you're talking about addition. So 12 times 5, switching the order, equals 5 times 12. That is switching the order. And that means that is commutative property of multiplication. Remember, 12 times 5 equals 5 times 12. You can do it right in the calculator. 12 times 5, 5 times 12. 60. Right? All right, so 10m plus 0 equals 10m. You start with this, and you end with the same. That is identity property. And that's of addition. A lot of times people forget number 8. Just remember, when we're talking about a grouping changing, the grouping is changing. If the grouping is changing, we're talking about associative property. And that is it. Okay. Just remember, the trickiest one, I would say, like the associative property, the identity property, the inverse property. I guess I just named all of them almost. But like, you know, this is basically memorization. So like very few times I say that in math, that it's memorization, but you do have to understand it a little bit. Remember, when we're talking about associative property, it's just the grouping that changes. So the parentheses are moving around the different set of numbers. Commutative property, it's just a switch. All right, 2 plus 1 equals 1 plus 2. Inverse property, just remember, you're multiplying. When you're adding, it's like 50 plus a negative 50. All right, we did not do here inverse property of multiplication. But if you did, just remember, it's like inverse property of multiplication is like 5 times 1 over 5. All right, and that equals 1. That is the inverse property of multiplication. And that's what I just wanted to put there as an example, because I didn't have it in the first 8. Number 9, 7 times 1 over 7 equals 1. This is an example of the inverse property of multiplication. So just remember that we're talking about the inverse 7 and the reciprocal, multiplying the reciprocal. And then that's the inverse property of multiplication. All right, let's talk about our first Regents problem. This was on the 2018 Regents. This was the first question. And you can see I wrote down, this is what they do. When solving the equation, and they give you this equation, what I typically do is rewrite it so I could actually do something, because they're going to ask you to do something with that equation. Evan wrote this as the next step, as his first step. So how did he get from here to here? Which property justifies that step? Well, let's see. We see parentheses, so I am going to right away do distributive property. So now I'm going to have 12x squared, 7 equals 7x, 6 minus 2x squared, and that's what he has. And negative 2 times negative 1, just be careful there, it's a positive 2. And that's exactly his first step. What property did we use? That's distributive property over subtraction. You see, it's happening over subtraction, so that is 4. They don't even have another distributive property. It's happening over subtraction, but they did not put distributive property over addition to get you confused. But if they did, it would not be the answer. It's over subtraction. Just remember, when you're answering questions like this, this is not subtraction property of equality. When you subtract on both sides, that's subtraction property of equality. Multiplication on both sides, when you multiply on both sides, that's the multiplication property of equality. Associative property is just the changing of the grouping. And I just put some examples here. Subtraction property of equality. We haven't gone over it yet, but x plus 7 equals 8. When you subtract on both sides of the equation to isolate the variable, it's x equals 1. This is the subtraction property of equality. If you add it on both sides, that would be called the addition property of equality. Multiplication property of equality, when you have 1/2 x equals 10, and you multiply on both sides, that would be multiplication. Associative property of multiplication, just remember we're talking about the change in grouping. And distributive property is what the answer is there. And that is it. All right, name the property that each statement illustrates. So we're just going to go through and hopefully remember. Now, again, these are all multiple choice questions usually, so you know that that's what it's going to be. So you could look back at the properties if you would like, just the property names though. See if you could choose without looking at the examples. Right, so we're talking about 27 times pi equals pi times 27. So all we're talking about is a switch. That is the commutative property of multiplication. The next one, 389 times 0 equals 0. This is the zero property of multiplication. And that's the zero property, but you could say of multiplication, but there is no zero property otherwise, so we're just going to say zero property. 7 over 9 times 1 equals 7 over 9. You start with the same thing, you end with that same number. So what do you think that is? Identity property of multiplication. And that's, you start with one number and you end with that same number. The 75 plus 6 equals 6 plus 75. All you're doing is flipping the numbers. They're equal to the same thing. So this is commutative property of addition. Commutative property. And that is of, not of multiplication. It is of addition, which is pretty easy to. All right, what we're going to talk about is h plus 0 equals h. Start with one thing, end with another. It is identity property of addition. All right. So look at the groupings of the next one. 6 plus 4 plus 2 equals 6 plus 4 plus 2, with the grouping changing from 6 plus 4, the parentheses, to 4 plus 2. This is associative property of addition. Okay, that is it. Take a look at that next one. 7 minus 6 times x minus 1 and 7 minus 6x plus 6. So what property is being used here? So what I like to do is just work on the left side to see if I can make it equal to what is on the right side. So I'm going to do distributive property. Every time I see parentheses and a number outside, I think it's distributive property. So that's what I'm going to do. So it's negative 6x, negative 6 times x, and negative 6 times negative 1 is a positive 6. Yes, that does equal the 7 minus 6x plus 6. That's exactly what I have. So what did I use? Distributive property of multiplication over subtraction. The exit slip regions question. The student was given the following equation to solve. And again, you could see it's very confusing. The student wrote it out. But he wrote it differently. It looks different than this. What property did the student use? All right, so let's see. If we have parentheses, I'm going to do that distributive property. So in my head, I'm going to just go, okay, this is negative 18x. This is 12. Negative 5 times x is negative 5x. And negative 5 times negative 3 is positive 15 plus 25 minus 3x. So that's exactly what the student wrote. So what property did he use? Well, that's distributive property. And you don't have to say it's over subtraction or addition. It's just distributive property. Because it happens over both, you don't have to add that it's both. You could just say distributive property. Now going down, the student combined like terms. So we're talking about negative 5x minus 3x, that's negative 8x. And then 15 plus 25 is 40. So that's what happened here. Then the student wrote this. What property did the student use in step number 3? So how do we get it to this? So if it's 10x on the right side and the 12 is just on the left side alone, the student did this. And it would cancel out here. It would become 12 equals 10x, negative 8x plus 18x is 10x plus 40. And that's what the student has. So what did they do? They added. So this is the addition property of equality. That's what the student did. That's what you put. Addition property. Don't make it more difficult than it is. Don't think about what another property that we learned. It is addition property of equality. And I just wanted to mention a little bit of lesson 3. Addition property of equality. If you add the same numbers on both sides, that is called the addition property of equality. So if you have something like x plus 3 equals 7, and that would be a good subtraction. There we go. X minus 3. And you add 3 on both sides. What you're doing, this is an example. X equals 10. That's the addition. You're adding you're adding on both sides. That's the addition property. If we're talking about x plus 3 equals 6, subtraction property of equality, you're subtracting on both sides, and that is x equals 3. And that's the property of equality that's happening there. Multiplication property of equality is simply something like this. Where you have a fraction or something like it. And I always use like 1/2, but I'm going to use 1/3. X equals 30. And you multiply 3 on both sides. What happens is that the 3's cancel out. And now x comes down alone. You isolated that x, and 30 times 3 is 90. That is multiplication property of equality. Division property of equality is simply 10x equals 50, and you divide by 10 on both sides. 10's cancel, and then x equals 5. So those are the properties that we really should have gone over before. Properties of equality. Addition property of equality is when you're adding on both sides. Subtraction property of equality when you're subtracting on both sides. Multiplication, multiplying on both sides. And division property is when you're dividing on both sides. So that is it. And that's where this exit slip is coming from, right? That step 1, everybody got that right. Distributive property. Everybody could see that that 6 is being multiplied. Like you have to distribute 6 to the negative 3x to the 2, then negative 5 to the x to the negative 3. You just say distributive property. But the next one, when you're adding on both sides, adding that 18x on both sides, what are you doing? You are using the addition property of equality, adding on both sides. And that's it. All right, and it's just about memorization here. You go through all of what it is, know some properties better than others, of course, like commutative property, very easy to know that it's just a switch. Associative property, just remember, associative property is about the grouping. And identity property, you start with one number, you end with that same number. It could be for addition or multiplication. Zero property, just remember, zero property is only for multiplication. Inverse property, that is a little bit more difficult, where you're talking about the inverse of addition, which is like, say, if you have something like 7 plus negative 7, that's equal to 0. And then if you have multiplication is 7 times 1 over 7 when you're multiplying the reciprocal. And then all of these properties they'll ask about as well. Right? And that's it. And I hope that helped. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.